The emerging food crisis. This is my tentative view on what's coming, what's causing it, and what to do about it. It's not primarily caused by the conflict in Ukraine, so a sudden peaceful solution to that conflict will not avert it. As a disclaimer, none of this is advice, financial or otherwise. I'm sharing my ideas. Please make your own decisions carefully. I'm increasingly convinced that this year will bring, in the best case scenario, much higher food prices than we're seeing now. And in the worst case scenario, a global famine of historic proportions, as Doomberg put it in an article published this weekend, Farmers on the Brink. The primary causes of this emerging food crisis are not resulting from the conflict in Ukraine, although that conflict is making the issue worse. A peaceful resolution to that conflict will not avert the food crisis, although it could shift the outcome toward a less terrible direction. Not that I expect that. Over the next month, I will conduct a series of interviews and panel discussions on my podcast in an effort to better understand the issue and what to do about it. Relying primarily on interviews will allow me to better understand the issue while staying focused on finishing my vaccine research so I can ultimately return to finishing my book. What I'm telling you now is my tentative view on what's causing the emergence of this crisis and what we can do about it. The reason I'm telling you this now, rather than waiting till I learn more from my interviews, is that right now, biased as I am toward my region in the northeastern United States, is a critical time to offer support to our local farms before the growing season begins in earnest. All right, so what's causing this crisis? This past weekend, the Doomberg team published Farmers on the Brink. You can just Google Doomberg Farmers on the Brink and it should come up first if you want to read that article. I've also linked to it in my Substack article version of what I'm telling you now at chrismasterjohnphd.substack.com. So this past weekend, Doomberg published Farmers on the Brink, which was a collection of insights gleaned from 2 weeks traveling the American Midwest, talking to farmers about the issues they face. Based on this article and several of their previous articles to which they link therein, I would summarize their arguments as follows in this 9-point bulleted list. Number 1, Europe has long been building over-reliance on intermittent sources of energy, such as wind, in their pursuance of renewable energy. This makes grids more vulnerable to fluctuations in demand or in wind power. As wind power runs out in those fluctuations, they must overconsume more reliable sources of energy, such as natural gas, that they have not budgeted for, thinking that the wind would provide it all, or provide more of it than it does, than it winds up doing. Corporations have also been pressured by speculators to not vertically integrate in ways that would lead to better stability. And this has made the European power grid fluctuating and fragile. These have led to shortages of natural gas, and downstream from this, shortage of dry ice for frozen transport and of ammonia for fertilizer, since natural gas is used to produce carbon dioxide, the source of dry ice, and ammonia. So here is our first shortage of fertilizer. Number 2, production of fuel generally, and especially oil, has not fully recovered from the COVID lockdowns as fast as demand has. The rising price of oil has led to further overconsumption of natural gas, further taxing fertilizer production. If you think that the price of gas is high because of Putin, just look at the chart of oil futures since April 2020. It's been going up in a straight line for 2 years since the bottom. All right, so number 2 is that the rising price of oil has led to further overconsumption of natural gas. If your choices are natural gas or oil, and oil is too expensive, you go overconsume the natural gas. Because natural gas is needed for fertilizer production, as noted in bullet point 1, then this further compromises fertilizer production. Oil is also the source of diesel, and most farm equipment runs on diesel. So, for example, 80%. Click the number. Most of the vehicles on farms and most of the fuel-powered farm equipment is using diesel. Natural gas is used to clean diesel of sulfur. So we have rising price of oil, shortage of natural gas, as well as rising cost, specifically in Europe, or especially in Europe. And that makes, wherever the cost of natural gas is high, in Europe particularly, the diesel can be prohibitively expensive to produce because the cost input doesn't allow it to be produced at a profit. But diesel is made from oil anywhere, and the price of oil is going up all over the world. So diesel is at least going to be more expensive due to those cost inputs, but less is being produced. And so there's generally short supply of diesel. And this is what most farm equipment is running on. Number 4, the high price of oil has made it expensive to mine phosphate for fertilizer. Mining things out of the ground requires fuel that comes from oil. And so now we have deficiencies of mined minerals. Just look at the chart of XME metals and mining ETF, or, the nickel craze or whatever. But for farming, this is a problem because phosphate is used for fertilizer and it's got to be mined out of the ground. And China last year banned the export of phosphate because it didn't have enough phosphate to grow its own food. Number 5, ammonia and phosphate are inputs into the synthesis of glyphosate, also known as Monsanto's Roundup. And there's a shortage of glyphosate. Many of you may love this. While it does mean less poison, it also means poor weed control in glyphosate-dependent fields this year. And 1 year of bad weed control can set back crops in that field for several years. And so, I hate glyphosate, but much of the world's food production is dependent on it. And there's going to be serious problems, at least this year and probably for several years, due to the glyphosate shortage. Number 6, the chip shortage caused by the COVID lockdowns is making farm equipment next to impossible to fix or replace. Number 7, vaccine mandates for international workers is causing a labor shortage. If we focus on American farming, that's largely driven by international work, which is in shortage in part because of these vaccine mandates. And Americans don't want to replace these workers, largely because Americans don't want to work on farms. But on top of that, the COVID policy-induced great resignation has made a shortage of Americans that are even looking for jobs, let alone any that want to replace the international workers. Number 8, 80% of grain drying in the United States runs on propane. Propane stores are running low. They are below their 7-year average. There's something like 35 or 40 days worth of propane left in storage. And politicians in the states where propane is imported from are trying to cut off propane supplies even further. Number 9, recent news we finally get to. The conflict in Ukraine is just a bitter cherry on top of all of this. Potash for fertilizer comes most abundantly from Russia, Belarus, and Canada. And on top of the military conflict and sanctions cutting off supply from Russia and Belarus, now the Canadian supply is at least temporarily cut off because Canadian Pacific has not been able to settle a dispute with the Teamsters, and so has locked them out. It's the opposite of a strike. So it's where the employer doesn't let you come to work. And so they basically just shut down the trains that run potash into the United States. So from the U.S. perspective, the one hope, Canada was the one import hope that could have made up for Russia and Belarus, and now that's out. Other news rolling in to add more bitter cherries on top include avian flu outbreaks that are leading to mass destruction of chickens. The rising price of food, of course, will also be influenced by labor shortages and fuel prices for transporting the food. This all falls on a backdrop of the great expansion of the money supply the Fed made in response to the COVID crash. My impression so far is that on top of the free money given to consumers that chased after food products, raising their prices up to this point. More recently, the speculative money that had blown up the tech bubble, that bubble is now deflating, and all that money is pouring into commodities, amplifying the price rises that are occurring because of the shortages. Notice that almost everything in this list is a result of COVID lockdown policy. It's COVID lockdowns, it's COVID mandates, it's COVID money printing. It's not COVID. It is every aspect of the policy response is what is risking a global famine of historic proportions this year. So wait till it's all over to count up the death count of how many lives did you save and how many did you cost. Anyway, moving on. Which farms will be most resilient? Since the emerging food crisis is being driven primarily by low supplies of fuel, chemical fertilizer, glyphosate, labor, and properly working equipment, it follows that the farms most dependent on these factors will suffer the most, while the farms least dependent on these factors will be the most resilient. At one extreme, a small family farm using the family's own labor, using horses in place of fuel-operated vehicles, exclusively using manure and compost as fertilizer, relying exclusively on non-chemical weed management, and selling all the food on a farm store so that it doesn't have to be transported anywhere, would be the most immune to this crisis. Additionally, having animals spread out on pasture will even help protect against the spread of pathogens like avian flu. So the traditional pasture-based farm of the pre-industrial era is basically the most resilient farm. There's not that many that fit that exact description. At the other extreme lies the bulk of industrial farming, which is basically maximally dependent on all of these inputs. I would say that most authentic organic farms, and when I say authentic, I'm distinguishing an actual organic farm from a large corporation that bought an organic brand, does not even comply with USDA organic policy, and then gets fined by USDA like $1,000 or $5,000 for blatant violation of the USDA standards, which is most of the organic that's in the store. And you can distinguish the actual authentic organic brands from the fake organic brands using the information at the Cornucopia Institute's website. So just Google Cornucopia Institute and it'll come up, or DuckDuckGo it or whatever. All right, so most authentic organic farms, I would imagine, lie somewhere in between the two extremes. They may have lower fossil fuel inputs, but they probably still have diesel-operated farm equipment and need to transport their food and so on. Still, even the horse-powered family farm would have to deal with the rising prices of all their other expenses in this inflationary environment. So while this would be the extreme case of resilience, no farm would be immune from the rising costs. My best guess is that the price of all food will go up, but the price of conventional food will go up much more than the price of authentically organic food, and the price of food at small local farms with low fossil fuel inputs will rise the least. Just throwing numbers out off the top of my head, I'm inventing these numbers, not calculating them from any data. I'm imagining that the $7 eggs go up to $9 while the $1 eggs go up to $5. So if you're the type of person who can afford or is willing to afford $7 on a dozen of eggs, you can probably absorb the $9 eggs. Whereas, if you're the type of person, or not even the type of person, just in the circumstances where it's difficult for you to afford $1 eggs and they go to $5, you're probably not going to be eating eggs. All right, so what should we do about this? I believe that our first duty must be to prepare to be able to continue to feed ourselves and our families. And end of sentence. Now, where we can do this, and in doing so, also support our communities and ease the effects of the crisis on others by making our communities more resilient to this, we must do that. So I'm not suggesting that any of us should sacrifice our own survival in the pursuit of the common good here. But I believe that we are going to need our communities in a crisis like this, and we should look for the intersection of those two things. So I believe that the best intersection between these two goals is to buy a share in a community-supported agriculture arrangement, or CSA. In these arrangements, you commit ahead of time to purchase a proportion of what the farmer produces for the season. You get a lower price for fresher, higher quality food while the farmer gets stability of cash flow. So in this case, you're not trying to save money by buying the cheapest stuff imaginable. You're trying to maintain or even improve the quality of your diet. And in doing so, cut out the middleman and give the farmer more reliability and stability of cash flow in exchange for a lower price per the cost of food item. So just having those lower prices by making that commitment will help counter the effects on any price rises that do occur at that farm. But you are also helping to capitalize that farm to make the signal as a consumer that we should expand operations at those types of farms. And if this is done now, it'll be done before the growing season operates in earnest. I have not talked to a farmer operating a CSA about the timing before I'm saying this. I'm speaking from the top of my head without knowing the details. But, just looking at the fact that in the Northeast, the planting season of most crops hasn't even started yet. It seems that now is the time to both signal to those farmers and to capitalize them that the demand for what they have is increasing, and they should use this money that they're getting at the beginning of the season to expand their operation. And so we're trying to capitalize the farms that will be most resilient to the crisis. One of the problems that we have is no matter how resilient regenerative agriculture may be in the face of this crisis, this is awfully short notice for the world to switch to regenerative agriculture. So my thinking process is that if a large number of people buy CSA shares now, perhaps the increased front-loaded investment in these farms will allow them to expand their operations, thereby shifting our farming landscape, somewhat in the direction of greater resilience. I say somewhat, in proportion, however many people do this, in that proportion, and of course, obviously in proportion to the capabilities of the farmers to expand their operations or to maximize, whatever output in whatever way they can. Obviously, they will have a cap on what they can do in a limited time. But I think that any move in that direction will at least marginally increase the resources devoted towards greater resilience before the thick of the crisis hits. Stocking up on foods that have long shelf lives is another way to find this intersection. If the price of food's going to go up and you buy it now, stocking up saves you money in the long run. And it also means more money goes to the farmers that you are buying the goods from. And so you are front-loading the money that they have available to invest this season. And so hopefully that is another way to help capitalize farmers doing the right thing and expand operations that will be more resilient to the crisis. The Shire app at shireapp.io, shireapp.io, can be used to locate sources of high-quality food near you. Even if you're buying foods from local farms, dried foods are going to have the longest shelf life. Frozen and lacto-fermented foods are also going to be stockable. You're basically looking to stock up on anything that is preserved in a way that will keep it from spoiling over the time frame that you expect to eat it within. On a personal level, I think that, regardless of the effects on the resilience of the food system, I think it's important that we all stock up on foods that have long shelf lives that we know are important staples for us and our families as a protection of ourselves and our families against these rising prices. So for me, for example, I'm stocking up on Paleo Valley beef sticks, sprouted lentils, sprouted brown rice, and foddy bars. And admittedly, foddy bars are basically healthy junk food, but they treat my digestive system well, and they're very useful to me in a pinch. And I've noticed them running in short supply. So that's also motivated me to stock up. So if Paleo Valley beef sticks, I'm a big fan of. I am an affiliate for Paleo Valley. If you go to chrismasterjohnphd.com/support/Paleo Valley, that's my affiliate link, and I'll get a commission for that. If you join the Master Pass at chrismasterjohnphd.com/masterpass, before you make that purchase and you follow the instructions in the exclusive discount section, I give my commission back to you as a rebate. And if you get a paid subscription to my Substack, chrismasterjohnphd.substack.com, you qualify for a 50% discount on the Master Pass membership fee. All right, but I think, I recommend trying Paleo Valley beef sticks. If you love them like I do, you might want to stock up on them. But I think that, we all need to think through what are the things that I will definitely be eating over the course of the next, I'll get to the time horizon in a moment. But over the course of the time, the next year or whatever we define as the period that we expect there to be food shortages or higher prices during, what are the things that are going to be absolutely essential? And among that set, what are the things that are, aren't perishable, that will last long enough that I can store them for and stock up on those things? All right, so how far ahead does it make sense to stock up for? Well, this depends on the shelf life of your food, the space that you have for storage, and what you believe about the long-term trend of inflation. For a while after the COVID pandemic started, I'd been listening to many conflicting voices on inflation. I felt uncertain about whether prices were going to go up or down, and felt most sure that there could be supply chain disruptions leading to short-term shortages, like happened early in the pandemic. So as such, I aim to keep a 3-month supply of most consumables. I live in the city where space is hard to come by. This is about the maximum of my storage space generally at all. And I figured it would help give me a little buffer against price fluctuations while also making sure that I didn't run out of something when a surprise shortage emerged. However, from listening to many voices on Real Vision, especially Lynn Alden, Darius Dale, Tony Greer, Warren Pies, and Michael Howell, I now believe that inflation may decelerate later in the year as a global recession and credit crisis are thrown on top of our military conflicts and food and fuel crises. And I would note that there's certainly ambiguity about the extent of the recession and when it will come. Basically, certainly it would be decelerating growth, at least coming, already here, but getting worse over the course of the year. And then, possibly an official recession, possibly this year, or possibly into next year. And similarly with this liquidity crunch and credit crisis emerging. So those things are going to counter the inflation. But, that means decelerating inflation rather than deflation. So I'm not expecting prices to go down, but I'm expecting the rise to slow. And of course, if there's food shortages, food might be the exception to that rule. So like the food shortages could, specifically mean that as the rise in prices for most things decelerates, it could still accelerate for food despite that. But at least there would be some countervailing force on it. So, in the absolute worst case scenario, I guess it's possible that the price of food could completely spiral out of control. But in terms of thinking through what is most probable, it seems, it seems like we're definitely not heading for general hyperinflation this summer. That would, make me panic and say, all right, I need to buy 2 years worth of food right now. And so my current mindset is that it makes sense to start with a base of a 3-month supply and then work gradually over time to put, any extra money that you have towards expanding that supply slowly toward the limits of what your space can accommodate. So it might make sense to have several years supply of things that'll actually last several years if you have that space. But it probably doesn't make any sense to pay for the storage of that food if you live in the city and you're going to pay a lot of money to store it. So, taking into account what would be considered like the maximal storage space that you have without paying extra for it, then I think moving from a 3-month supply over time to fill that up is probably making sure not to buy any food that you won't eat before it spoils is probably the best course of action. Now, no one, especially me, knows the future. But I do think it's likely that we get another round of stimulus checks to help us through unaffordable food and gas prices. And in that case, I think whatever deceleration inflation might have occurred by that point, it may well flip and we get into more aggressive inflation suddenly. And that might be a time to practice more aggressive stocking up. So I do think that the situation is worth monitoring and looking for signs such as that we should be more aggressive in stocking up on food. But I think my base case right now is go with start with a 3-month base and move in the direction of expanding those supplies gradually while keeping an eye on the relevant news to see whether it makes sense to at any point get more aggressive than that. As to what society should do, I believe that we need an all-out effort to increase domestic energy production in all forms, especially oil and natural gas. Now, I know that the intersection of the Venn diagram of people that support small local farms and regenerative agriculture and domestic oil and gas production, that the Venn diagram of that overlap might be small. But look, I think that no matter how real or imminent climate change may be, there's no way on earth that it is even remotely as imminent as this global food crisis that's emerging right now, right here. And while I think we definitely need to work toward less dependence on fossil fuels, risking a global famine to get there is horrific and should be completely off the table. I also think I also have a serious moral problem with the NIMBYism, or not in my backyardism, of opposing domestic oil production and outsourcing it to other areas of the world that then require wars to maintain. I think that's exceedingly hypocritical. We're not solving climate change by outsourcing our oil drilling to faraway places where it still gets drilled, that we then have to maintain an enormous military and kill people over. That's not, I think that's a way to make yourself feel good about opposing the oil industry while not actually doing any good. So, or actually, harming the world. And so I think that there's no way that a global famine is going to be good for the politics of climate change either. I mean, the more this turns into a terrible crisis, the more that putting climate before people eating is just going to get voted out. So I think that I think the right thing to do is to massively invest in increasing production while also trying to reduce our dependency on fossil fuels. I believe that we are doing the precise opposite of that. We are antagonizing domestic supply while giving tax cuts and stimulus checks to deal with the high prices. That will worsen the shortages by increasing demand and reducing supply. We should be increasing supply and reducing demand, but we can't pretend that we can be infinitely elastic with the demand. Like, if the production of the whole global food system is dependent on oil, we cannot, like this month, decide to do away with the oil dependency of the global food system. We just won't have food. So I think that as a society, I think the only responsible thing to do is to massively invest in increasing production while we also try to curb our demand. And I think the things that I've outlined here, by supporting local farms that are less fossil fuel intensive and less or not at all chemical fertilizer intensive, I think those things do reduce our demand. So we should produce the oil and natural gas that we need while doing these things to, I believe that at this point that this crisis is coming no matter what. And so whatever we can do now to make ourselves more resilient, I think will also reduce the demand for fossil fuels. But in the meantime, we have to try to avert the crisis as much as possible. And that means, as much as I'm not an advocate at all of the current food system, that means doing everything as a society that is possible to keep that food system running this year. And hopefully whatever crisis does hit, it hits because it had to, not because we did all the wrong things. And then we use that to further increase the consciousness about the need to move in more resilient directions. And over time, we improve our resilience, reduce our demand, and then, the need to supply those fuels goes down, the price goes down, the incentive to keep drilling and producing those things goes down, and then by not needing those fuels anymore, that's how we wind down our use of them. So anyway, these are my tentative views, subject to revision as I learn more from relevant experts I interview on my podcast. I'll be sure to update you as my views evolve. As a disclaimer, none of this is advice, financial or otherwise. I'm sharing my ideas. Please make your own decisions very carefully. And I would love it if you could like and share this video. And please head over to my Substack and give the post that I wrote about this some love by subscribing to my Substack at chrismasterjohnphd.substack.com, and by giving it a like, giving it a share, and leaving a comment there. Thank you very much.